In 1977, investigative journalist Gordon Thomas uncovered something that shouldn't have existed. Deep within declassified CIA files, he found traces of Operation Often, a program that officially studied behavioral and toxicological effects of certain drugs. But Thomas discovered the real story was far stranger. While the official MK Often documents described standard pharmaceutical research, Thomas's investigation revealed CIA staff astrologers on payroll, agency-funded sorcery courses, and field tests involving occult practices. When CIA Director Richard Helms received the program summary in 1973, his response was swift and telling. Just 2 words scrawled across the file: read, destroy. Here's what makes this credible. The CIA wasn't dabbling in magic because they believed in it. They were studying it as a psychological weapon, exploring how occult beliefs could be weaponized for interrogation, manipulation, and control. The question isn't whether the CIA believed in astrology, it's whether they discovered how to use other people's beliefs against them. What Thomas found suggests they did exactly that, and the implications reach far beyond Cold War espionage. When we think about CIA mind control experiments, most people immediately jump to MK-Ultra. But here's what the declassified documents actually reveal. MK wasn't a single program at all. It was a prefix, essentially an alphabet soup of behavioral research operations that the agency ran for decades. MK-Ultra, MK-Search, MK-Chitwit, MK-Often. Each letter combination represented a different avenue of exploration into the darkest corners of human psychology and control. Understanding this web is crucial because it shows us how the CIA approached behavioral modification as a comprehensive science, not just random experiments. They weren't throwing darts at a board. They were systematically mapping every possible way to alter, control, or weaponize the human mind. MK-Ultra launched in 1953 under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who believed that consciousness itself could be reverse-engineered and reprogrammed. The official goal was straightforward: develop techniques to make enemy agents talk, protect American operatives from interrogation, and create reliable methods for behavioral control. What emerged was far more extensive than anyone imagined. The program operated through an intricate network of cover organizations, university partnerships, and private contractors. Researchers at prestigious institutions like Harvard, Stanford, and McGill University conducted experiments on unwitting subjects, funded through CIA front organizations with innocent-sounding names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Patients in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, soldiers, thousands of people became test subjects without their knowledge or consent. The techniques they explored read like a catalog of psychological torture: massive doses of LSD administered for weeks at a time, sensory deprivation chambers, electroshock therapy designed to erase memory, hypnosis combined with drug cocktails, and something they called psychic driving, playing recorded messages to unconscious patients for months on end to completely restructure their personalities. But here's where the story gets complicated. In 1973, just as congressional investigations were heating up, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of virtually all MK-Ultra records. Boxes of documents, decades of research, detailed experimental logs, almost everything went into the incinerator. What we know today comes from a small cache of financial records that survived by accident, discovered in 1977 during a routine budget review. The Senate Church Committee investigations between 1975 and 1977 put these surviving fragments on public record, giving us our first glimpse into the scope of the MK programs. But even these revelations only scratched the surface. The committees focused primarily on MK-Ultra's drug experiments and the most egregious cases of abuse, the stories that would generate headlines and satisfy public outrage. This is where Operation Often enters the picture, and where the official narrative starts to fracture. The declassified documents describe MK Often in the dry, clinical language typical of government bureaucracy, a program to test the behavioral and toxicological effects of certain drugs on animal and human subjects. The records mention Edgewood Arsenal, the Army's Chemical and Biological Warfare Center, and reference something called EA3167, a nerve agent tested on human volunteers in 1973. On paper, it looks like just another chemical weapons research program, similar to dozens of others conducted during the Cold War. Military volunteers, controlled laboratory conditions, careful documentation of physiological responses, standard operating procedure for that era of biological warfare development. But investigative journalist Gordon Thomas uncovered a completely different story. According to his sources within the intelligence community, the real operation often had nothing to do with nerve agents or traditional chemical warfare. Instead, it was the CIA's systematic exploration of occult practices as potential intelligence tools. Thomas describes a parallel program where the agency employed astrologers, fortune tellers, and psychics on regular salary. He details experiments conducted in the basement of the United Nations building in New York, where mediums attempted to influence the thoughts and decisions of foreign diplomats during crucial negotiations. His sources describe seances in CIA safe houses, attempts to photograph the human aura, and research into whether curses and hexes could be weaponized. This duality isn't unusual in intelligence work. Government programs routinely operate on multiple levels, official narratives designed for public consumption, and classified operations running in the shadows beneath. The Brotzing Manhattan Project, for example, maintained elaborate cover stories about metallurgy research while secretly developing atomic weapons. The U-2 spy plane program operated under the cover of NASA weather research for years. What makes Operation Often particularly intriguing is how perfectly the two narratives complement each other. Chemical weapons research provides ideal cover for occult experiments. Both involve testing unusual substances and techniques on human subjects. Both require extreme secrecy, and both push the boundaries of conventional science and ethics. Consider the practical advantages. If you're conducting seances in government facilities, you need a reason for the security clearances, the classified meeting spaces, and the unusual personnel on payroll. A legitimate chemical weapons program provides all of that infrastructure. The same laboratory that tests nerve agents can easily accommodate experiments with consciousness-altering rituals or psychic phenomena. The most sensitive details about these overlapping programs remain classified to this day, and I share some of the deeper intelligence insights I've uncovered through my exclusive newsletter for those who want to dig deeper into these hidden operations. The pattern becomes clearer when you examine other MK programs. MK Search officially focused on developing new interrogation drugs, but former operatives describe extensive research into hypnosis, telepathy, and what they called remote viewing, the ability to gather intelligence through psychic means. MK Chitwit supposedly studied the effects of certain chemicals on animal behavior, yet researchers involved in the program later spoke about attempts to control human subjects through ritualistic practices combined with psychoactive compounds. This layered approach to covert research makes perfect sense from an operational security standpoint. If congressional investigators or foreign intelligence services discovered the official program, they would find exactly what they expected: documented research into conventional weapons or behavioral techniques. The deeper experiments could continue undisturbed, protected by the very transparency of their cover operations. The destruction of records in 1973 takes on new significance in this context. Helms wasn't just eliminating evidence of illegal drug experiments. He was erasing any documentation that might reveal the full scope of the agency's exploration into unconventional warfare techniques, including their systematic study of occult practices as potential intelligence tools. Understanding this duality becomes crucial for evaluating what really happened with Operation Often. The official records show us the tip of the iceberg, enough to satisfy oversight requirements and deflect serious investigation. But the real program, according to sources like Thomas, operated in the spaces between the documented experiments, exploring possibilities that would have seemed impossible to rational minds but potentially invaluable to intelligence operatives, desperate for any advantage in the Cold War's psychological battlefield. In May 1971, according to Gordon Thomas's meticulous investigation, the CIA took a step that would have seemed absurd to the agency's founders. They hired 3 professional astrologers at $350 per week, plus expenses, substantial money for that era, equivalent to nearly $2,500 weekly in today's dollars. These weren't casual consultants brought in for a quick opinion. They were full-time contractors with one specific mission: predict the future for America's intelligence apparatus. Thomas paints an almost surreal picture of what followed. Picture this scene: CIA briefing rooms where bearded mystics and women dressed in traditional gypsy attire explained the intricacies of palm reading and phrenology, the supposed art of reading personality through skull bumps, to stone-faced behavioral scientists. These weren't Hollywood consultants brought in for entertainment. These were serious government employees, taking notes as fortune tellers demonstrated how to interpret lifelines and cranial formations. The program expanded rapidly. By early 1972, palm readers and clairvoyants had joined what Thomas describes as an increasingly bizarre circle of government contractors. One particularly telling incident involves a San Francisco astrologer who was later exposed as a complete fraud. Rather than terminating the contract, the CIA continued paying full fees and travel expenses. This wasn't incompetence, it was systematic data collection. The agency wasn't necessarily seeking accurate predictions. They were studying how these belief systems functioned and how they might be weaponized. Thomas documents one of the most peculiar field tests in intelligence history. A medium was escorted through the public areas of the United Nations building in New York, while a CIA operative discreetly filmed the entire encounter. The psychic's instructions were straightforward: signal whenever he sensed what he called an evil type of personality among the diplomats and staff moving through the corridors. The operative dutifully recorded every gesture, every pause, every claimed supernatural insight. No hits were recorded that day, but the footage and behavioral analysis went straight back to Langley. The agency's approach to exorcism research reveals the methodical nature of their occult investigations. When CIA researchers approached the New York Archdiocese requesting access to study exorcism rituals, church officials declined. Undeterred, the agency pivoted to public occultists who were more willing to cooperate. Enter Sybil Leek, the famous Houston sorceress who had achieved celebrity status through television appearances where she would arrive with her pet crow perched on her shoulder. Leek represented exactly the kind of public-facing occult figure the CIA found valuable, someone with established credibility in mystical public-facing circles, who could provide insights into how supernatural beliefs influenced behavior and decision-making. The agency's methodology becomes even more intriguing when we examine how they funded academic research. Agents presented themselves as representatives of the Scientific Engineering Institute, a CIA-linked front organization operating near Boston with connections to Polaroid. Using this cover, they funded what Thomas describes as a comprehensive sorcery course at the University of South Carolina involving 250 students. This wasn't a fringe seminar tucked away in some basement classroom. This was a fully funded academic program designed to study occult practices with scientific rigor. What exactly were MK-Offen scientists investigating through these seemingly bizarre channels? Thomas's research reveals three primary areas of focus. First, fertility rites. The agency wanted to understand how various cultures used ritual and ceremony to influence reproductive behavior and community bonding. Second, initiation rites, the psychological mechanisms by which groups indoctrinate new members and create lasting loyalty through ceremonial practices. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, necromancy, literally the practice of attempting to communicate with or raise the dead. This wasn't the CIA dabbling in supernatural nonsense. This was systematic behavioral research using occult practices as a laboratory for understanding human psychology. Agency scientists recognized that millions of people worldwide organized their lives around mystical beliefs, made major decisions based on astrological readings, and participated in ritual practices that created powerful group bonds. Understanding these mechanisms meant understanding how to influence populations that operated outside conventional Western rationality. The documentation Thomas uncovered reveals an agency approaching the occult with the same methodical precision they brought to chemical interrogation or psychological warfare. They weren't seeking to prove or disprove supernatural phenomena. They were studying belief systems as tools of influence and control. Every seance attended, every astrological reading funded, every ritual documented provided data about how human beings respond to mystery, authority, and the promise of hidden knowledge. Consider the broader implications of this research. While the American public debated the ethics of foreign interventions and domestic surveillance, CIA scientists were quietly mapping the psychological territories that govern human behavior at its most fundamental level. They were studying not just what people believed, but how belief itself could be manufactured, directed, and weaponized. The University of South Carolina sorcery program exemplifies this approach. By embedding their research within academic institutions, the agency could study occult practices while maintaining plausible deniability and scientific credibility. Students participating in these programs had no idea they were contributing to intelligence research. that might later be used to manipulate populations through carefully crafted mystical narratives or supernatural claims. What makes Thomas's account particularly compelling is the level of bureaucratic detail he provides. These weren't rogue agents pursuing personal interests. This was institutional policy, complete with budget allocations, progress reports, and systematic documentation. The CIA had created an entire division dedicated to understanding and potentially exploiting humanity's oldest beliefs about the supernatural, the mystical, and the unknowable. The implications extend far beyond Cold War espionage. In studying how people respond to claims of supernatural insight or mystical authority, the agency was essentially reverse engineering the psychological foundations of faith, superstition, and spiritual belief, knowledge that could be applied to influence any population anywhere, at any time. December 10th, 1972, a single sheet of paper lands on desks across the CIA's Office of Research and Development. No letterhead ceremony, no bureaucratic flourish, just 2 words in Richard Helms' handwriting: read, destroy. That's it. No explanation, no transition plan, no preservation of research assets. The entire operation, often infrastructure, built over 18 months of careful cultivation, gets the kill order in the most abrupt termination in CIA program history. Gordon Thomas's sources paint a fascinating picture of what happened in those final days. Sidney Gottlieb, the architect of the entire MK program family, actually went to Helms personally. Picture this: the man who'd overseen LSD experiments on unwitting subjects, who'd orchestrated mind control research across multiple continents, was now pleading to keep a program alive. According to Thomas's intelligence contacts, Gottlieb argued that often was just hitting its stride, that the occult research was beginning to yield actionable intelligence frameworks. Helms refused. Not just refused, he apparently cut Gottlieb off mid-sentence and issued the termination order on the spot. But here's where it gets really interesting. 3 days later, a follow-up memo surfaces from the Office of Research and Development. This one does offer a rationale, but it's written in that peculiar intelligence bureaucracy language that tells you everything while saying nothing. Moral and ethical, and extremely sensitive security considerations. Now, if you've studied intelligence documentation, that phrase is basically a flashing red light. In CIA parlance, moral and ethical concerns don't typically refer to the ethics of the research itself. Remember, this is the same agency running MK Ultra. When intelligence officials cite moral and ethical issues, they're usually talking about political exposure risk. The ethics they're worried about aren't abstract philosophical concerns. They're the ethics of getting caught. Extremely sensitive security considerations is even more telling. In intelligence contexts, this language appears when operations have become so exposed that they threaten broader agency security. Not when experiments fail to produce results, when they threaten to produce congressional hearings. The timeline tells the real story here. May 1971 often launches with the hiring of that astrologer in New York. The program expands steadily through 1970, one into early 1972. We're talking about courses at major universities with 250 students, experiments in the UN diplomatic building, agents operating under institute covers across multiple cities. By late 1972, the operational footprint is massive. Then December 10th, 1972, instant kill order. But here's the kicker: June 1973, just 6 months later, official MK often paperwork surfaces showing EA3167 nerve agent testing with military volunteers. So while the occult research gets the emergency shutdown, the chemical weapons testing continues under the same program name. That tells you exactly what kind of exposure Helms was worried about. Think about the political blast radius often had created. University courses meant faculty oversight, academic administrators, student records. The UN building experiments meant international diplomatic exposure. Imagine the headlines if foreign diplomats discovered the CIA was testing psychic warfare in their meeting spaces. Agents using institute covers across multiple cities created a network so wide that a single blown cover could unravel the entire operation. I see 3 distinct factors that likely triggered Helms' panic response. First, optics and oversight. By late 1972, Often's operational signature was enormous. Too many people, too many institutions, too many potential witnesses. The astrologer alone knew she was working for the CIA. What happens when she talks to the wrong journalist? Those 250 university students in the psychic research courses, how long before someone connects the dots between their curriculum and agency funding? Every agent operating under institute cover represents a potential blown cover story. Second, yields failure. According to Thomas's sources, the UN building experiments were producing essentially random results. No statistical significance, no actionable intelligence patterns. The astrologer was apparently caught fabricating predictions to maintain her contract. When your occult research starts looking like expensive theater, even the CIA starts asking hard questions about budget allocation. Third, tradecraft exposure. This is probably what really spooked Helms. Often's operational model required agents to operate in public venues, academic institutions, and front organizations with minimal cover. Traditional intelligence operations maintained strict compartmentalization. Often was doing the opposite. It was creating connections across institutions that could expose not just the program, but the entire methodology of how the CIA embeds in civilian organizations. That read destroy memo fits a very specific pattern in intelligence damage control. It's the kind of terse communication you use when you don't want detailed explanations living in files that might eventually surface in congressional hearings. No paper trail means no smoking gun documents for future investigators to discover. The contrast with how other MK programs were terminated is stark. MK Ultra had formal closure procedures, asset transfers, research preservation protocols. Often gets 2 words and a match. What makes this even more significant is the timing relative to broader CIA exposure. This is December 1972, just months before the Watergate investigation starts pulling at threads that will eventually expose the entire intelligence community to unprecedented scrutiny. Helms wasn't just shutting down a research program. He was conducting preemptive damage control for an agency that was about to face the most intensive congressional oversight in its history. The fact that EA-3167 nerve agent testing continued under the often designation tells you everything about CIA priorities. Chemical weapons research with military volunteers, manageable exposure risk, controlled subjects, military chain of command, national security justification. Occult research with civilian academics, foreign diplomats, and freelance psychics. Political suicide waiting to happen. The real question isn't why Offen was terminated. It's what else got the same 2-word treatment that we haven't discovered yet. Because if the CIA was willing to abandon 18 months of occult research investment over exposure concerns, what other programs disappeared without a trace when the political calculus shifted? Here's the thing about investigating claims like Thomas's operation. Often revelations, if even half of what he described actually happened, there should be a paper trail. Not just whispered rumors or second-hand accounts, but real documents sitting in filing cabinets, university archives, and corporate records. The beauty of bureaucracy is that it creates documentation, even for the most sensitive operations. Let's start with the University of South Carolina angle, because this one should be the easiest to verify. Thomas claims that in 1971-72, the CIA funded a course involving 250 students in what was essentially practical occult training, fertility rites, necromancy, the whole spectrum of ritual magic. Think about what that means from an administrative perspective. Universities don't just conjure courses out of thin air. They require catalog entries, departmental approval, room assignments, and most importantly, someone has to get paid to teach this stuff. The course catalogs from 1971 to 72 should still exist in the university archives. These weren't internal CIA documents subject to Helms' destruction order. They were public university records. If a course was offered to 250 students, it would appear in the official catalog, probably listed under religious studies, anthropology, or sociology. Maybe it was disguised as comparative religious practices or anthropological study of ritual systems, but it would be there. More revealing would be the departmental meeting minutes from that period. When you're proposing a course that involves fertility rites and necromancy, even with academic cover, that generates discussion. Department chairs don't just rubber stamp unusual curriculum proposals, especially ones funded by outside sources. There should be meeting notes, faculty concerns raised, budget discussions about the external funding source. And here's what's really interesting. If 250 students were enrolled in hands-on occult training, someone would have talked. College newspapers in the early 1970s were fearless about covering controversial topics. Student journalists would have been all over a story about CIA-funded sorcery classes. The campus newspaper archives should contain articles, letters to the editor, maybe even investigative pieces about this mysterious, well-funded course in ritual magic. Then there's the Scientific Engineering Institute connection. Thomas describes SEI as the funding conduit, with CIA officers using it as corporate cover while channeling money to the university program. This creates multiple documentation points. SEI would have filed corporate paperwork, grant applications, correspondence with both the CIA and the university. The money trail here is particularly important because Thomas specifically mentions Polaroid's involvement through SEI. Corporate partnerships generate invoices, contracts, reimbursement requests. If SEI was paying for university courses while maintaining its Polaroid connections, there should be internal Polaroid memos questioning why they're funding occult research at a South Carolina university. Financial departments ask those kinds of questions. Grant letters between SEI and the university would be especially revealing. Universities keep meticulous records of external funding sources, particularly when the amounts are substantial enough to support courses for 250 students. The university's development office would have correspondence detailing the funding arrangement, reporting requirements, maybe even restrictions on what could be publicly disclosed about the research. Now let's examine the UN building operation, because this one involves multiple bureaucracies that love documentation. Thomas claims CIA operatives escorted a medium through the UN headquarters while filming her psychic impressions with concealed cameras. The UN isn't some abandoned warehouse, it's one of the most security-conscious buildings in New York. Anyone entering UN headquarters requires visitor passes, which means names in security logs, escort assignments, and most crucially, filming permits. Even covert filming operations need some kind of administrative cover. The CIA couldn't just walk a medium through UN corridors without explaining their presence to security personnel. The visitor logs from early 1972 should show entries for whoever the CIA claimed to be that day. Maybe they posed as documentary filmmakers or academic researchers, but they needed legitimate-sounding credentials to access areas beyond the public tour route. There should be temporary filming authorizations, grounds pass ledger entries, maybe even staff notes about the sensitivity walkthrough or whatever cover story they used. What makes this particularly verifiable is that UN security protocols create duplicate records. The main security desk, individual floor checkpoints, even elevator operators in 1972 might have logged unusual visitor movements. If a medium was being escorted to specific locations for psychic readings, that's not normal tourist behavior that someone would have noted. The New York Archdiocese angle presents different challenges but equally specific documentation possibilities. Thomas claims the CIA approached church officials seeking access to exorcism cases and possession records. The Catholic Church maintains extensive archives, and correspondence with government agencies definitely gets preserved, especially when it involves sensitive theological matters. A refusal letter from the Archdiocese would be particularly valuable because it would acknowledge the CIA's request while documenting the Church's response. Internal memos discussing the government's interest in exorcism cases would reveal how church officials interpreted and responded to these unusual inquiries. The challenge here is that churches remain extremely protective about anything involving exorcism or paranormal phenomena. Even decades later, Archdiocese officials might be reluctant to confirm government interest in their possession cases. But the documents themselves should exist in church archives, filed under correspondence with federal agencies or special theological consultations. The practitioner payment trail offers the most concrete verification opportunity because money always leaves traces. Thomas identifies 3 astrologers receiving $350 weekly plus expenses, including one San Francisco practitioner who was exposed as fraudulent but continued receiving payments. This level of specific detail suggests real financial records. The CIA's accounting system, even for covert operations, required expense vouchers, vendor payments, maybe even 1,099 tax forms for contractors earning substantial amounts. $350 weekly in 1971 to 72 was serious money, roughly equivalent to $2,200 today. Payments at that level generate documentation, The San Francisco fraud case is particularly interesting because Thomas claims the CIA continued paying this astrologer even after discovering the deception. That suggests internal memos weighing whether to terminate the contract, discussions about operational security, maybe even debates about whether fraudulent psychics could still provide useful intelligence insights. Travel expense reimbursements for these practitioners would create another documentation layer. If astrologers were being flown to various locations for CIA consultations, there should be airline tickets, hotel receipts, per diem payments, all processed through whatever administrative cover the agency was using. Here's what's crucial to understand. Discovering authentic documentation for even one of these claims would transform the entire Operation Often story. Finding the University of South Carolina course listing, or SEI correspondence with Polaroid about funding occult research, or UN visitor logs showing CIA personnel escorting a medium through headquarters, or archdiocese letters refusing government access to exorcism cases, or payment vouchers for the 3 astrologers. Any single piece of verified documentation would shift this from allegation to substantiated historical fact. The paper trail approach matters because it moves beyond testimonial evidence into the realm of bureaucratic reality. Governments, universities, corporations, and churches all create records, and those records tell stories that individual accounts might miss or misremember. What makes this investigation particularly compelling is that we're not looking for smoking guns hidden in classified vaults. We're looking for routine administrative documents that should exist in multiple locations, created by people who had no idea they were documenting one of the CIA's strangest operations. When you first hear about Operation Often, the natural reaction is skepticism. CIA agents at seances, military personnel testing ritual psychology. It sounds like something out of a Hollywood thriller. But here's what changes everything. This isn't the first time the CIA has ventured into territories that sound impossible. In fact, when you examine the documented history of American intelligence operations, Often doesn't stand out as an anomaly. It fits a well-established pattern of experimentation that pushed every conceivable boundary. Let me walk you through the precedents that make Operation Often not just plausible, but predictable. Start with Operation Midnight Climax, one of the most brazen examples of covert human experimentation ever documented. Between 1955 and 1965, the CIA operated safe houses in San Francisco and New York that functioned as elaborate laboratories for testing LSD on unwitting civilians. They weren't running these experiments in sterile government facilities. They were using actual brothels and apartments, complete with prostitutes on the CIA payroll. Picture this. Unsuspecting men would visit what they thought were ordinary establishments, only to have their drinks spiked with powerful hallucinogens. CIA operatives would then observe from behind one-way mirrors, recording everything while the subjects experienced intense psychological effects without any idea what was happening to them. The agency paid cash, maintained detailed records, and operated these facilities for a full decade in major American cities. Think about the infrastructure this required. They needed front companies to lease properties, a network of paid operatives who could maintain cover stories, sophisticated recording equipment, and a chain of command that could authorize ongoing operations involving unwitting American citizens. When you consider that the CIA was comfortable running covert drug experiments in brothels for 10 years, the idea of sending a psychic consultant through the United Nations building seems remarkably modest by comparison. But Midnight Climax wasn't an isolated case. At Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, Army researchers spent years conducting human trials with incapacitating nerve agents and chemical compounds. Volunteers, often soldiers who had little real understanding of what they were signing up for, were systematically exposed to experimental substances designed to produce delirium, confusion, and altered states of consciousness. The researchers maintained meticulous catalogs of these compounds, designated with EA numbers, EA standing for Edgewood Arsenal. They documented everything: dosage levels, duration of effects, behavioral changes, long-term impacts. And here's where it connects directly to Operation Often. In 1973, when Often was supposedly winding down, paperwork references EA3167 being tested on 2 military volunteers. This wasn't theoretical research. It was an active program feeding experimental data into the broader MK family of operations. What this establishes is crucial. The concept of laboratories testing fringe human effects wasn't some wild departure from normal intelligence work. It was already operational, already feeding into covert programs, and already producing the kind of data that operations like Often would have been designed to explore. Then there's Dr. Ewan Cameron's work in Montreal, which reveals how far the CIA was willing to go when academic cover provided plausible deniability. Through front organizations, the agency funneled money to Cameron's psychiatric experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute. His psychic driving program subjected patients to sensory deprivation, massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy, and endless loops of recorded messages designed to break down and rebuild their personalities. Patients entered Cameron's program seeking help for relatively minor psychological issues and emerged with devastating memory loss, unable to recognize family members or remember basic life skills. The CIA funded this through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, a benign-sounding front that masks some of the most extreme psychological experimentation ever conducted on human subjects. This demonstrates the agency's willingness to mix fronts, universities, and ethically explosive research under covers that sounded completely legitimate. When you understand that pattern, the idea of using academic consultants and research institutions to explore ritual psychology starts to look like standard operating procedure. Perhaps most relevant to Operation Often is the documented history of U.S. remote viewing programs. For nearly 2 decades, intelligence agencies paid researchers and soldiers to attempt psychic surveillance, literally trying to see distant locations through mental projection. This wasn't a brief experiment. It was a sustained effort conducted at Stanford Research Institute, various military installations, and Army units at Fort Meade. The remote viewing program continued into the mid-1990s, finally ending only after external review concluded the data was too unreliable for operational use. But here's the key insight. This wasn't about belief in psychic phenomena. It was about weaponizing any phenomenon that might provide an intelligence advantage, even if it worked only occasionally or under specific circumstances. The institutional logic was simple. If there's even a small chance that consciousness can access information through non-traditional means, then intelligence agencies need to understand how that works and whether it can be enhanced, directed, or countered. This same logic would have applied to ritual psychology, suggestion techniques, and the kind of belief system manipulation that Thomas described. When you map out these documented programs, a clear institutional pattern emerges. First, there's the use of fronts and conduits, safe houses for midnight climax, university covers for Cameron's work, research institutes for remote viewing. Second, operations in public venues, brothels and apartments for drug testing, hospitals for psychological experiments, and in Thomas's account, international buildings like the UN. Third, systematic exploration of fringe human effects, drugs, sensory deprivation, parapsychology, and potentially ritual belief systems. Finally, cleanup procedures, the same read and destroy mentality that ended Operation Often was used to eliminate records from multiple MK programs when public scrutiny became a threat. If this is the established pattern, and the documentary evidence proves it is, then MK Often fits perfectly, not as literal sorcery, but as a systematic laboratory for testing how ritual, suggestion, and authority structures influence human behavior and decision-making. The CIA wasn't trying to summon demons. They were trying to understand whether ritual contexts could enhance psychological manipulation, whether occult symbolism could trigger specific responses, and whether belief systems could be weaponized for intelligence purposes. Understanding this pattern changes everything about how we evaluate claims like Thomas's. When an intelligence agency has already demonstrated willingness to dose civilians with hallucinogens, fund extreme psychiatric experiments, and spend decades testing psychic phenomena, the burden of proof shifts. The question isn't whether they would have explored ritual psychology, it's whether they would have been negligent not to explore it. Here's the thing that most people miss when they hear about Operation. Often the CIA wasn't trying to summon demons or cast actual spells. They were running something far more sophisticated and arguably more dangerous, a comprehensive study of how belief systems could be weaponized for intelligence operations. When you strip away the sensational occult imagery and look at what Thomas described through an intelligence analyst's lens, a completely different picture emerges. Every single activity he documented serves a specific research purpose that has nothing to do with supernatural powers and everything to do with human psychology and behavioral manipulation. Take the astrologers and palm readers the CIA allegedly consulted. From an intelligence perspective, these interactions weren't about predicting the future. They were perfect laboratories for studying how people respond to perceived supernatural authority. Think about what happens when someone sits down with a fortune teller. They reveal intimate details about their fears, desires, relationships, and decision-making processes to a complete stranger, simply because that stranger claims special knowledge. For intelligence officers, this represents a goldmine of data about human vulnerability and the mechanics of trust building through claimed esoteric expertise. The fertility rites and initiation ceremonies Thomas mentioned become even more interesting when viewed as psychological research. These rituals don't just involve participants, they transform them. The CIA would have observed firsthand how symbolic actions, group participation, and ritualized experiences create powerful psychological bonds and measurable behavioral changes. This isn't mysticism, it's applied psychology on steroids. Understanding how ritual creates loyalty, breaks down individual resistance, and forges group identity would be invaluable for recruiting assets, managing double agents, or infiltrating foreign organizations. The alleged necromancy studies reveal perhaps the most practical intelligence application. Death-related beliefs and fears influence human decision-making more powerfully than almost any other psychological factor. By studying how different cultures and individuals respond to death imagery, ancestor worship, or communication with the deceased, the CIA could develop incredibly sophisticated tools for psychological manipulation. Imagine knowing exactly which death-related fears would break a particular target during interrogation, or how to exploit a foreign leader's ancestral beliefs to influence their political decisions. But the most telling example might be that incident at the UN building where Thomas claimed a medium was brought in to detect evil personalities among diplomats. The official story sounds absurd until you realize what the CIA was actually testing. They weren't trying to identify evil people. They were studying how the mere presence of someone claiming psychic abilities would affect diplomatic negotiations. Would diplomats become more guarded, more superstitious, more vulnerable to suggestion? How could the introduction of a supposed psychic element be used to disrupt enemy intelligence operations or gather information about foreign officials' psychological profiles and cultural beliefs? The University of South Carolina's sorcery course involving 250 students represents the crown jewel of this research program. You couldn't design a better controlled environment for studying mass psychological responses to occult practices. With 250 participants, the CIA had a statistically significant sample size to test how different individuals respond to ritual, suggestion, and group occult activities. They could identify personality types most susceptible to supernatural influence, measure how occult practices affect decision-making and social bonding, and develop profiles for predicting who might be vulnerable to belief-based manipulation techniques. This research would have supported multiple CIA objectives simultaneously. New interrogation techniques could incorporate ritualistic elements, supernatural fears, or claimed esoteric knowledge to break down resistance more effectively than conventional methods. Propaganda operations could be enhanced by understanding how to exploit specific cultural and religious beliefs in target populations. Foreign operations could leverage local supernatural beliefs, shamanic practices, or religious conversion techniques to achieve intelligence objectives. Most importantly, this occult research could supercharge existing mind control programs like MK-Ultra. While MK-Ultra focused heavily on drugs and psychological techniques, Operation often would have explored how ritual, symbolism, and belief systems could enhance or replace chemical methods of control. Why drug someone into compliance when you can use their own belief system to achieve the same result? This approach has documented precedent in CIA operations. The agency has a long history of studying and exploiting indigenous shamanic practices, researching religious conversion techniques, and analyzing how spiritual beliefs affect political behavior. Operation often simply represents the most comprehensive and systematic approach to weaponizing supernatural belief systems. The December 1972 shutdown makes perfect sense when viewed from this perspective. The program likely wasn't terminated because it failed. It was shut down because it succeeded too well. The research had probably identified techniques so effective and ethically problematic that continued operation posed unacceptable political risks. Remember, this was during the height of congressional scrutiny of CIA domestic operations. If Operation Often's belief manipulation techniques had been exposed, the public backlash would have been devastating. That language about moral and ethical and extremely sensitive security considerations strongly suggests the program had discovered something significant enough to be genuinely dangerous if revealed. You don't use that kind of careful, loaded language unless you're sitting on research that could cause serious problems if it became public knowledge. What we're really looking at is a belief engineering laboratory, a systematic effort to understand how supernatural and occult frameworks could influence human behavior more effectively than conventional psychological operations. The CIA wasn't trying to prove magic was real. They were proving that belief in magic could be more powerful than magic itself. This changes everything about how we understand both historical CIA operations and ongoing intelligence activities. If you're starting to see the deeper implications here, share this with someone who needs to understand how belief systems can be weaponized, because this research didn't just disappear in 1972. When you step back and examine operation, often through the lens of intelligence history, a disturbing picture emerges, one that reveals far more about the nature of hidden power than most people are prepared to confront. This wasn't some rogue operation dreamed up by a few eccentric agents fascinated with the occult. Operation often represents something much more systematic: the intelligence community's recognition that human consciousness itself is the ultimate battlefield. While the public debate focused on nuclear weapons and conventional warfare, agencies like the CIA were quietly mapping the deepest territories of the human mind. Think about the sophistication this reveals. By the 1960 seconds, intelligence analysts had moved beyond crude propaganda techniques. They understood that the most effective control systems operate at the level of belief itself. When you can influence what someone considers real or possible, when you can shape their fundamental assumptions about reality, you don't need to control their actions directly. They'll police themselves. This is why Operation Often's alleged focus on astrology, necromancy, and ritual practices makes perfect strategic sense. The CIA wasn't trying to summon demons or predict the future through star charts. They were studying something far more practical: how belief systems function as behavioral control mechanisms. How do you get someone to act against their own interests? How do you make them compliant without them realizing they're being manipulated? How do you exploit the psychological frameworks people use to make sense of their world? Consider the implications. If you understand how astrological belief influences decision-making patterns, you can predict and potentially manipulate the choices of world leaders who consult astrologers. If you comprehend the psychological dynamics of ritual participation, you can design ceremonies that create specific states of suggestibility or group cohesion. If you map the neural pathways activated by spiritual experiences, you can potentially trigger those states artificially. The genius of studying occult practices wasn't about embracing supernatural worldviews. It was about reverse engineering the most powerful influence technologies ever developed by human civilization. Religious and mystical traditions represent thousands of years of trial and error research into consciousness modification. They've identified techniques for altering perception, inducing trance states, creating unshakable conviction, and binding individuals to group identities. From an intelligence perspective, these represent proven methodologies waiting to be weaponized. This connects directly to what we explored earlier about the CIA's broader research portfolio. MK-Ultra investigated chemical and psychological approaches to mind control. Operation Midnight Climax studied behavioral modification through sexual compromise. Programs like Stargate explored remote viewing and psychic phenomena. Operation often fits seamlessly into this pattern. It was simply extending the research into belief-based manipulation techniques. But here's what makes this particularly chilling. The sophistication suggests these agencies developed capabilities that most people can't even conceptualize. We're not talking about crude brainwashing or obvious propaganda. We're talking about influence systems that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, that work by reshaping the fundamental categories through which people interpret their experiences. The abrupt shutdown and document destruction orders tell us everything we need to know about how sensitive this research became. When intelligence agencies are willing to destroy their own work rather than risk exposure, it means they discovered something too dangerous for democratic oversight. The read and destroy directive suggests Operation often crossed lines that even the CIA considered problematic, not from an ethical standpoint, but from a political survival perspective. This pattern continues today, just with different terminology. Programs investigating remote viewing, consciousness research, and anomalous phenomena keep surfacing in declassified documents. The Pentagon's recent UAP disclosures aren't just about unidentified aircraft. They're revealing ongoing government interest in phenomena that challenge conventional understanding of reality. The same institutional mindset that created Operation often is still active, still pushing boundaries, still exploring any avenue that might provide strategic advantage. What does this mean for ordinary citizens trying to understand the world around them? It means the gap between public knowledge and classified capabilities is far wider than most people imagine. While we debate surface-level political issues, intelligence agencies may possess sophisticated tools for influencing belief, perception, and decision-making that operate completely outside public awareness. The academic connections are particularly revealing. Operation often allegedly involved researchers from major universities, using the cover of legitimate scholarship to pursue intelligence objectives. This creates a troubling question. How much of what we consider independent academic research is actually serving classified agendas? How many studies of human behavior, consciousness, or belief systems are feeding data into intelligence databases? The use of front organizations and cutout groups means that influence operations can be laundered through seemingly legitimate institutions. A foundation funding research into religious practices might actually be mapping belief systems for intelligence purposes. A university study of decision-making patterns could be developing behavioral prediction models for operational use. The public sees academic freedom and scientific inquiry. Intelligence agencies see research and development for influence technologies. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth. Operation often reveals the extent to which intelligence agencies view their own populations as potential targets. The techniques developed through programs like this don't distinguish between foreign adversaries and domestic citizens. Once you've perfected methods for exploiting belief systems and psychological vulnerabilities, those capabilities exist regardless of who they're used against. The democratic implications are staggering. How can citizens make informed decisions if their fundamental perceptions of reality are being shaped by classified influence operations? How can democratic institutions function if intelligence agencies possess tools for manipulating the belief systems that underpin political choice? How can we maintain accountability over agencies whose capabilities we can't even comprehend? Whether every detail of Jim Thomas's account is accurate becomes almost irrelevant when you examine the documented precedents and institutional patterns. Agencies that conducted non-consensual drug experiments on citizens, that infiltrated religious organizations, that developed techniques for sexual compromise and psychological manipulation. These same institutions exploring occult practices for operational advantage isn't aberrant behavior, it's business as usual. The real revelation isn't that operation often happened. It's that programs like this represent the logical evolution of intelligence work in an era where consciousness itself has become a battlefield. The agencies tasked with protecting national security have concluded that understanding and influencing human belief systems is essential to their mission. The question isn't whether such programs exist, it's how sophisticated they've become and how widely they're being deployed. If this investigation into the hidden dimensions of intelligence operations has expanded your understanding of how power actually functions in our world, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."